Another by request video, running back offensive line changes heading into 2026. Yeah, that's right. We are talking an entire video dedicated to offensive lines, but we are looking at it from a fantasy perspective. Which lines made clear upgrades that we need to acknowledge and key in on to trust their running backs in 2026? Which lines made big changes but are kind of unclear a little bit in terms of outcomes, and we got to monitor these situations heading into training camp and preseason. And of course, which lines struggled last season due to injuries and are bound to bounce back in 2026. Again, if you have any specific topics that you want me to cover, drop them in the chat. We're going to start off happy and work our way down here. Let's start off with the positive, clear upgrades here. Las Vegas, come on down. The Las Vegas Raiders offensive line was the biggest issue by far on the team in 2025, and they had their issues. They had a ton, but the offensive line, they just couldn't get past it. I mean, there were all kinds of problems, right? From coaching to quarterback, but at the end of the day, the bad offensive line is the core problem of that offense, and you just can't work around it. But the Raiders, they knew all this, and they went out and they addressed every single issue, and they will have a new look offensive line in 2026 to go along with their new coaching and their new quarterbacks as well. Now, the big offensive line change is the addition of Tyler Linderbaum. Fantastic. Will that be enough, though, to upgrade them from what was genuinely genuinely, definitely the worst offensive line in the NFL? Well, yeah, it's definitely going to be a big help, and coaching can obviously help continue the improvement of the young offensive linemen that they have on roster, like Jaxson Powers-Johnson, right? And they did have strong veteran presence as well existing there, so this is workable. I think they've made the right addition, the right changes, and this can be redeemed, right? The Raiders were dead last year in average yards per carry, and their pass blocking had poor Geno Smith, in literal fits of terror. But for us, the most critical boost here, again, we're talking running backs here, we need this boost for Ashton Jeanty. Ashton Jeanty cracked 4 yards per carry in literally just 2 games last season. Yeah, moment of silence for that one. That was nasty. The changes, they may not shoot this line up to a top 5 offensive line, but it is more than enough to make a significant change for them, and more importantly, more than enough to help justify Ashton Jeanty's lofty ADP. So we're heading in a very positive direction here in Vegas. I want to talk about the Carolina Panthers next. I want to point out the Panthers because they have really invested into this offensive line year over year. They invested a first round pick into the offensive line. They made a solid free agency addition as well. They drafted some depth. They are clearly very dedicated to building this lineup, and they, by all indications, want to lean on the ground game. That is kind of critical here for us. We've talked about this a lot before. Bryce Young had just 4 games last season with over 200 passing yards. I've got no problem with Bryce Young pushing volume. I want that. He was good at it when he did it. I want that for the receivers. I would love that for Tedrow McMillan. I would love that for my boy Jalen Coker, right? But unfortunately, it's very clear they just don't want to force him to have to push aggressive volume, even if he can do it. They want to be a balanced offense, and they want to lean on the ground game. So them continuing to build this offensive line is critical for us because both Chuba Hubbard and Jonathon Brooks are in play as solid picks. We've talked about this before, right? It's kind of a win-win situation for us. You target one, you target the other one, you just target somebody because something is going to give here, right? Either Chuba retains the job and he's a bargain because he's got the RB3 draft capital and he ends up being a 3-down back, goes back to where we originally felt like he should have been, and boom, it pays off, right? There's also the possibility that, he splits with Jonathon Brooks. He retains-ish the job, right? He keeps the goal line preference, and Brooks has the receiving work. Or, here's the possibility, right? And this is why Jonathon Brooks is critical as well. It's possible that if Jonathon Brooks stays healthy, he can just flat out outplay Chuba Hubbard, right? And you end up with a situation where Chuba loses his job, but it's not that big of a deal from a fantasy perspective because, again, we don't have a lofty, elevated ADP for him. So he's a fine target as well. And then, of course, you guys know that I love Jonathon Brooks as a target because, again, if he stays healthy, the Panthers have made it clear they want him on the field. They're going to get him on the field doing receiving work. All he's got to do is get on there, outplay Chuba Hubbard, and he can just flat out earn that spot here. So we've got multiple viable options here, and the fact that this line is continuing to improve is very important for us. Let's also talk about the Giants here. The Giants also made significant investment in terms of draft capital into their offensive line and added some depth as well. So I do not anticipate any struggles for this line for Jaxson Dart or Cam Skattebo. This would or could be one of those situations, honestly, where they make a very significant leap this season in terms of the offensive line if they stay healthy. Now, I still have my opinions that we need that ADP for Jaxson Dart to come down a little bit here, but I do want to talk about the running back situation, right? Because again, if this line stays healthy, it's very reasonable to expect that they could ascend to be a top 10 line. Now, looking back at 2025, it's not exactly easy to make a judgment in terms of efficiency on Cam Skattebo because his stretch that he was healthy in was played against very strong run defenses. But the Giants' running backs as a whole weren't exactly averaging prolific numbers. This continued improvement of the line will absolutely help them reach another level in terms of yardage, specifically Cam Skattebo, because he is the 3-down back here before. And I've talked about this before, but I don't feel like I've emphasized it. I really do like Skattebo. This is not me doing a full fade on the Giants offense and really not even a full fade on Jaxson Dart. I just need that ADP to come down because I just can't justify drafting him over guys that I know are more reliable, right? If it comes down more, I'm cool, right? But when it comes to Cam Skattebo, I love his ADP and the value that he brings and the upside that he brings for it for real. I really do think that he is an excellent target for his value, and he does legitimately have top 12 upside. Last year, between weeks 2 and 7 before the injury, Skattebo had a minimum of 11 carries with a very healthy amount of targets. That's a key there. Targets, he's a 3-down back. Over that stretch, he did not finish outside of the top 24. That is impressive. We have to highlight that because when it comes to running backs, you often get the guys that's like, okay, he had a, top 10 week here, finished as a, RB 40 over there, right? But there wasn't a lot of variance. He had the highs and he didn't really have lows because the receptions were there to kind of make sure that there were balances out. So he was putting up consistent top 24 numbers, despite it being a very difficult stretch in terms of defenses, right? So very impressive for him. And again, the Giants weren't a particularly good team, right? And then, in terms of receiving threats, unfortunately, we had the injury to Malik Neighbors. So the pass game was Wan'Dale Robinson. I've, again, talked about my concerns in terms of volume and consistency for Jaxson Dart. I do think this team is going to try to lean aggressively on the ground game, particularly with Malik Neighbors recovering and getting up to speed as well here. And the offensive line upgrade will only make this leaning on the ground game more of a priority for them. Now let's talk about lines with big changes that we need to monitor and ones that have players returning from injuries. We'll start off with the easy one here in terms of this one being an injury one. The LA Chargers are very straightforward. And this is probably the most critical one to talk about because I felt like it was pretty straightforward, but I still see, a lot of comments every now and then from people saying that the Chargers have a bad line, and they don't. They did last season, but that was not their fault. At full health, it is a very strong offensive line. The Chargers season has to be assessed in pieces, right? I talk about my love for Quinshon Judkins often, and I talk about the early season because unfortunately they lost Rashawn Slater, prior to the season even starting. But then very early on in the season, they lost Joe Alt, and really that was just way too much for them to handle. They had, additional injuries on top of that, and they had linemen that just kind of underwhelmed. It was a mess. They couldn't maintain a very solid starting unit. There were some weak points. Those points are gone, right? They added several new faces in terms of adding depth as well. So they addressed the problems with depth just in case injuries are an issue. They should be getting these top linemen back from injury. Clearly, they refuse to go through all of that again. Again, Alton Slater should start the season healthy, right? And with all of the new added depth, this offense will be in a much better place in 2026. I mean, we've dove into it in terms of not just the offensive line coming back, but the changes in scheme as well. Everything is pointing up. There's just so much to love about this Chargers offense. Now, New England. New England is kind of the is it technically the opposite of this? This is very interesting. Yeah, no, it's the opposite. of the Chargers, right? Because New England made investments into their offensive line last year and everything was cool, right? It was cool. We're like, wow, they've really turned things around until they got to the playoffs. And then everything went sideways, unfortunately. And that's concerning, right? They hit tough competition and the line couldn't hold. And that's concerning again for us because New England will have a much tougher schedule in 2026. It's not the cupcake schedule they saw in season last year. Now they have made some changes. Am I confident that those changes will create a very significant impact? I don't know, honestly. A big one is the addition of Elijah Vera-Tucker. He hasn't exactly been reliable, unfortunately, in terms of staying on the field. He did come from that aforementioned Jets team that I talked about. And they also made a first-round investment as well to their offensive line. So this could work, right? But one of the things that we have to do here is we have to monitor this during training camp because, again, this offensive line is not only critical for Drake May, but honestly, this is extremely critical for us from a running back perspective, right? Because Drake May can put up fantasy numbers up behind a mediocre line, right? But it's critical from a fantasy perspective for the running backs because it has sneaky impact. If the line is subpar again and the competition is tougher, we could see the continued reliance on Rhamondre Stevenson because he's the far better blocker over TreVeyon Henderson. It's just a fact. I don't love it. I don't love to say that, but it is a fact, unfortunately. So if they feel like they need that additional help of a very solid blocking running back, they will turn to Rhamondre more often than not. Again, so it's very critical from a fantasy perspective because if you're drafting TreVeyon Henderson, you're drafting him to be a starter. This is not backup area. This is not like we were talking about with Chuba Hubbard where you're drafting him as an RB3, and if you miss it, it's like, because I got, two others that were my starters. This is kind of like a flex option for me. I had plans, right? Not the same thing with TreVeyon. Not the same thing there in terms of where he is going. It's come down a little bit, but not enough to truly justify it, right? We cannot have his numbers looking like they did in the playoffs for where we are drafting him. So again, what is very critical with this line is the impact that it has on running back snap count. So means that we have to look out for this one to see how this line is gelling in preseason. Now the Browns, we must talk about the Browns. The Browns are a very critical team to monitor here because the Browns did a full overhaul and they lost a longtime starter in Joel Bitonio. One of two things can happen here, right? And, that's always the outcome. It'll be either great or awful, right? I don't know if there's really an in-between here because this is one of those offensive line situations where it's a retool situation with a lot of veterans, right? So the line will either bust or it will make a significant improvement compared to last year. And the quarterback, whoever that may be, will actually be able to stay in the pocket and more confidently operate the offense. Again, the offensive line is the most critical aspect of this team because no quarterback that is on roster for the Browns is going to thrive behind the line that they had last year. And again, we only had the reliable options of being the tight ends last year from a receiving perspective. So if the line works out here, it's a very sneaky situation because we've got the addition of two new rookies who I do like both of them, right? And because they're on the Browns, we don't have to draft them up where we're drafting Cardell Tate, right? We don't have to draft them where we're drafting Mekhi Lemon. No, we get a nice little discount on these guys, right? To where they're not major impacts if it's a bust, right? And we do feel very confident, I do feel very confident for sure, that they're going to both be able to step over Jerry Jeudy in terms of targets fairly early, in my opinion. And again, from a running back perspective, very critical for Quinshon Judkins as well, because this was a very strong rookie season. It goes overlooked a little bit here because they were an objectively awful team. But despite playing on an objectively awful team, if you remove the injury games from him, right, where he got injured, his 17-game pace last year was just under 1,000 yards. Mind you, that was with zero offseason preparation because he had that little legal issue in an objectively awful team. I mean, from what I saw, I feel very encouraged in terms of his talent and his ability. If this offensive line can pan out, even halfway, I feel very positive about him. Again, Myles Garrett is gone, but put some respect on Jared versus name. Please do. He's one of my IDP players. I love him a lot in Dynasty. He's a great young rookie. He's not Myles Garrett, right? But he's being underestimated. He's a great young replacement here for what is still going to be an overall very strong defense. They should keep games close. The game should not get out of hand. That is what is very critical for Quinshon Judkins. If it all pans out, Judkins, who is a 3-down back, would have RB1 upside. So again, with this one, because complete overhauls can go two very different ways, right? We got to look out for this one. Try and figure out how it looks like in preseason, because if this line can gel together, there are going to be some sneaky winning fantasy options from here. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can find me across all social media platforms at It's Tara Time. I am also live every Wednesday on YouTube at 8 p.m. EST, so make sure that you stop by and chat. It is always a good time. You can ask me any questions that you want. You can also subscribe to my Substack if you want to support me another way. And if you are looking for new fantasy football tools in 2026, look at Player Profiler. You can use my promo code TARA for 25% off at Player Profiler.